The Sea Flower. London, 1621. The city was a maze of smoke and sorrow, narrow lanes choked with beggars, the stench of refuse, the cry of hunger echoing off damp stone. Work was scarce, and when it came, it was cruel. Women scrubbed until their fingers bled and still went unpaid. Margaret Turner knew that life too well. She had worked since childhood, washing linen for a merchant's wife, mending torn sleeves by candlelight, waking before dawn to fetch water from the well that reeked of iron and decay. The winters were bitter and the summers no kinder. The poor starved in both. Men returned from war broken, their limbs gone, their eyes hollow. Disease took the young and the old alike, and the price of bread climbed higher than any honest woman could reach. Margaret had long since stopped believing that anything would ever change. Then one day, in the muddy marketplace, she heard a crier reading aloud from a broadside nailed to a post. The Virginia Company of London seeks good, honest women of virtue and courage to sail for the New World. Passage and provisions funded. Marriage to industrious planters upon arrival. A better life awaits beyond the sea. The words burned in her mind. She had no dowry, no family, no hope left in England. Yet when she heard a better life, she imagined green fields and clear skies, a place where the world might begin again. She sold what little she owned for the cost of a cloak and a small chest, then walked to the docks at Gravesend to sign her name in the company's register. The clerk wrote it down with a flourish, as though it already belonged to another world. The ship that would bear her across the ocean was called the Sea Flower, not large, but sturdy, her hull tar dark, her sails patched and sun-bleached. On the morning of departure, fog hung low over the Thames. The women stood together, wrapped in shawls, their faces pale as ghosts. Margaret clutched her chest and watched the spires of London fade behind her as the tide carried them downriver toward the open sea. The first week was fair, the wind steady and strong. The ship rolled through grey-green waves while gulls wheeled above the masts. The women slept in narrow hammocks slung between beams, their belongings tied up in small bundles. Food was hard biscuit and salted meat, coarse but bearable. But soon the sea grew rough. A gale rose out of the west, snapping the rigging and driving rain through every crack. For 3 days and nights, the Sea Flower pitched and heaved, water sloshing across the deck. The women prayed in the dark, clutching one another as the ship creaked like a living thing in pain. When the storm passed, the sky cleared to a hard, endless blue. The ocean stretched in every direction, no land, no birds, only the hiss of wind and wave. Time lost meaning. Days blurred into weeks. The food spoiled, the drinking water turned brackish, and the smell of sickness filled the hold. One young woman died of fever and was buried at sea, wrapped in sailcloth, lowered gently into the deep. The captain read from his Bible, his voice trembling as the sea closed over her. Margaret watched in silence, her heart pounding. She had never been so far from everything she knew. Yet she found a strange peace in the rhythm of the waves, in the wide, fierce beauty of the sky. Sometimes, when the nights were calm, she would stand at the rail and look at the stars, bright and uncountable, scattered like seeds across the black water. The sailors said they were steering by those same stars toward Virginia, where the rivers ran wide and the soil was rich. They spoke of tobacco, the brown gold that filled every ship returning to England. "You'll see," one old sailor told her, his beard shining with salt. "The leaf buys everything there, food, land, a man's whole life. You plant it, you dry it, and you're rich enough to eat every day." Margaret could scarcely imagine such plenty. But when she thought of the fields waiting across the ocean, she whispered a prayer that some small piece of that promise might be hers. After 10 long weeks, a sailor's shout broke the monotony. "Land ho!" The women rushed to the deck. On the horizon, the faint green line of forest rose out of the morning mist, the edge of a world that seemed both new and ancient. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She had crossed an ocean, and she was still alive. The Sea Flower dropped anchor in the wide, brown mouth of the James River. The shoreline was wild and thick with cypress. Smoke rose from the small fort of Jamestown, where timber houses crouched behind a rough palisade. It wasn't the shining city they had imagined, but it was real, and it was waiting. The air was heavy and full of life. Insects droned, frogs croaked from the reeds, and the scent of pine sap mingled with the sharp tang of the river. As Margaret stood on deck, trembling with weariness and wonder, she thought, "I have come farther than I ever dreamed possible." The Virginia Company officials lined the women up while the settlers gathered, men browned by sun and toil, some shy, some bold, each with the hunger of lonely years in his eyes. They had paid the company in tobacco for the women's passage, each man surrendering 120 pounds of leaf to the warehouses at Jamestown, an enormous sum in a land where tobacco served as both wealth and money. In Virginia, tobacco was the lifeblood of everything. Gold had not been found in the New World, but the leaf had become its treasure. Dried, packed into great casks called hogsheads, it was shipped across the Atlantic to England, where merchants paid dearly for the sweet, smoky leaf. That trade filled England's coffers, and kept Virginia alive. Here, the leaf wasn't just a crop, it was currency. A man's wages, a woman's dowry, a preacher's salary, a cow, a house, even the price of a wife, all measured in pounds of tobacco. Margaret listened to the clerk call out names and watched as women were matched to the men who had paid their passage. Some smiled nervously, others wept. When her name was called, a quiet man stepped forward, hat in hand. His face was sunburned, his hair fair, his clothes plain but clean. "Beg pardon, miss," he said, "you are called Margaret Turner?" "I am. My name's Thomas Avery. I've land upriver, corn, beans, and a fair field of tobacco. It isn't much, but it's mine. I can promise work, a roof that mostly keeps the rain out, and a kind word now and again." Margaret studied him, a man roughened by labor but gentle in manner. She nodded. "That's more than I've ever had." They were married that same day under the pine rafters of the little church, the parson's voice echoing in the warm air. When the vows were spoken, Thomas took her hand and led her upriver through the deep green forest. The road was little more than 2 ruts through the mud, the trees rising high on either side. When they reached his homestead at dusk, she saw a small cabin by a bend in the river, its chimney breathing thin smoke. "It's not London," Thomas said, almost shyly, "but it's home." Margaret stepped inside. The floor was rough, the walls uneven, but the hearth glowed with firelight. On the mantel stood a clay pot with a single rose cutting, the only one she had seen since leaving England. For the first time in years, she felt the weight in her chest ease. "Then home it shall be," she whispered. The seasons turned, and Margaret learned the rhythm of the Virginia fields. In spring, they planted the tobacco, each seed no bigger than dust, each plant tended by hand. In summer, the leaves grew broad and green, heavy with sap. By autumn, they were cut, tied, and hung in the curing barn, their scent sweet and smoky. Miller, the parson, even the company taxes. A good harvest meant safety, a bad one meant hunger. Thomas showed her the tobacco notes he kept in a carved box, slips of paper signed by the warehouse clerk, each one a promise of leaf stored in Jamestown. "These," he told her, "are as good as silver here. A man's worth is counted not in coins, but in pounds of cured leaf." Margaret marveled at the thought that green plants growing outside their door could serve as money, could buy sugar or cloth, or even passage on a ship. Back in London, she had worked a lifetime for coins she never kept. Here, the earth itself paid her back. When the harvest was over, they rolled their hogsheads down to the river and traded a few bundles for salt, a kettle, and a bolt of linen. It wasn't riches, but it was freedom. In the second year, Margaret bore a child, a daughter with hair the color of autumn straw. Thomas wept when he held her. "We'll call her Hope," he said softly. Margaret smiled through tears. A good name for a new world. Hope grew as the settlement grew. Each season brought more ships, more people, more fields. There were hard years too, droughts, sickness, storms that flattened the crops, but they endured. At night, after the day's labor, Margaret sat by the fire with Hope in her lap, teaching her letters by the flicker of the flame. Sometimes she thought of the women who had sailed with her, scattered now across the colony, each building her own small world of earth and leaf and faith. One evening, as the sun sank over the fields, Margaret stood on the porch watching Hope chase fireflies in the fading light. Thomas came beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever think," he asked, "what made you cross that ocean?" She smiled. "Hunger, maybe. And hope. And a ship called the Sea Flower." He chuckled. "Then I'm glad you did." They stood together, the air rich with the scent of cured tobacco. Margaret looked out over the land they had tamed, the rows of golden leaves stretching to the river. Above them, the stars appeared one by one, steady and bright, the same stars that had once guided the Sea Flower across the endless sea. Hey, hope you enjoyed the story. Tobacco wives were a real thing in early America. Only men came across in the early settlement of Virginia, and only later did women come to make its settlement permanent and sustainable. Tobacco was the currency. Everything was bought and sold by pounds of tobacco because early America had no currency, no gold or silver to even mint coins. Times were hard then, and they're hard now. We don't work for tobacco or coins, just likes. So take a second and please give us a like or a thumbs up. It really means a lot to us. Thanks, and feel free to subscribe for more stories.